When I found the letter hidden inside the yacht's false wall, I realized why everyone in our harbor town refused to step foot on this billionaire's boat for the past 15 years. My name is Cadence Morrison, and I restore boats for a living. 6 months ago, my sister Della vanished while investigating something in these same waters. I thought taking this job would help me move on. I was wrong. The Meridian's Edge had been sitting in Millfield Harbor like a ghost ship since Billionaire. Quentin Ashford died 3 years ago. 180 feet of pristine white yacht that nobody wanted to touch. The locals whispered about strange lights flickering on deck at midnight and how anyone who got too close ended up with terrible luck. My father, who runs the harbor, begged me not to take the restoration contract, but I needed the work. More than that, I needed something to fill the endless hours I'd been spending staring at the water, waiting for Della to come home. She was a marine biologist, brilliant and fearless, the kind of person who would dive into dangerous waters if it meant protecting marine life. The Coast Guard called off the search after 2 weeks. They said she probably had an equipment failure during a deepwater dive. Case closed. Except Della was too careful for equipment failure. She triple-checked everything. The night before she disappeared, she called me at 2 a.m, voice shaking with excitement. She said she'd discovered something that could change everything. Something about illegal activity in our coastal waters. She promised to tell me everything when she got back from her final dive. She never came back. Now here I was, 3 months later, standing on the deck of a yacht that gave our entire town the creeps, holding a crowbar and wondering if I was making the biggest mistake of my life. The estate lawyers had offered me triple my usual rate, enough money to keep my restoration business afloat for another year. All I had to do was make this floating tomb seaworthy again so they could sell it. The yacht looked perfect from the outside, like Ashford had just stepped off for lunch. But the moment I climbed aboard, something felt wrong. The air was too still, too heavy. Personal belongings remained exactly where he'd left them. Expensive artwork lined the walls, nautical instruments sat polished and ready for use, and his private study was filled with more marine research documents than any tech billionaire should need. That first morning, I found correspondence between Ashford and several marine research organizations, payment records for something called Project Deepwater, consulting contracts with marine biologists. And there, in black ink that made my heart stop, was my sister's name on a contract dated 2 months before she vanished. Della had been working for Quentin Ashford. My hands shook as I read through her contract details. She'd been hired to conduct water quality assessments in deep coastal areas, the same areas where she'd been doing her independent research, the same areas where she'd disappeared. The contract was worth more money than Della had ever mentioned, certainly more than a graduate student doing marine research should have been earning. I called my Uncle Ferris, who runs the Harbor Light diner and knows everyone's business in town. When I mentioned finding Della's name in Ashford's papers, the line went completely silent. "Cadence, you need to get off that boat right now." "Why? What aren't you telling me?" "That man was trouble when he was alive, and he's still trouble now that he's dead. Some folks around here know things they aren't saying, things about what really happened to your sister." The call ended with a click that echoed across the empty yacht deck. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Della's last phone call, about the fear mixed with excitement in her voice. I thought about all the research documents I'd found, about the town's strange superstitions, about my uncle's warning. Most of all, I thought about the consulting contract with my sister's signature on it, a contract that suggested she'd been involved with Ashford's operation right up until the moment she disappeared. Something had happened on this yacht. Something the whole town was afraid to talk about, and I was going to find out what. The morning after finding Della's contract, I stood in my workshop at dawn, staring at the Meridian's Edge through salt-stained windows. My restoration business sits right on the water in Millfield Harbor, a place where I've rebuilt everything from century-old fishing boats to modern sailing yachts. It's honest work that keeps my hands busy and my mind focused, or at least it used to. 6 months ago, everything changed when the Coast Guard called to tell us Della was missing. My brilliant little sister, who could identify marine species by Their breathing patterns and had memorized every current and tide chart for our entire coastline had simply vanished during what should have been a routine research dive. The official report said equipment failure in deep water, but anyone who knew Della knew that was impossible. She was obsessive about her gear. I'd watched her check and recheck her oxygen readings, test her depth gauges, inspect every seal and valve before every single dive since she was 16. Our father taught us both that the ocean doesn't forgive careless mistakes, and Della took that lesson to heart more than anyone. The night before she disappeared, she'd called me at 2 a.m, breathless with excitement, and something else I couldn't identify at the time. Fear, maybe, or anger. "Katie, I found something huge. Something that's going to blow this whole thing wide open." "What thing? What are you talking about?" "The contamination readings I've been tracking. It's not accidental runoff like everyone thinks. Someone's been deliberately dumping toxic waste in the protected zones. I have proof." I'd sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. "Della, that's dangerous. If someone's committing environmental crimes, you need to report it to the authorities." "I will, but I need more evidence first. One more dive tomorrow, and then I'll have everything I need to shut them down." That was the last time I heard her voice. For months afterward, I threw myself into my work, restoring boats with desperate intensity. Every morning I'd wake up hoping to see her research vessel pulled up to the dock, Della climbing out with her diving gear and that mischievous smile she'd had since childhood. Every evening I'd watch the harbor until dark, then go home to an empty house that still smelled like her favorite lavender shampoo. My father, Captain Rourke Morrison, runs harbor operations for the Port Authority. He's the kind of man who knows every boat, every captain, and every secret in our little coastal town. After Della disappeared, he aged 10 years in 10 weeks. The guilt aided him because he'd taught us both to love the ocean, and now the ocean had taken one of his daughters. When Ashford's estate contacted me about restoring the Meridian's Edge, Dad's reaction was immediate and fierce. "Absolutely not, Cadence, that boat is cursed." "Dad, you don't believe in curses. You're the most practical man I know. I believe in patterns. I believe in paying attention when something doesn't smell right. That yacht has been sitting in my harbor for 15 years, and in all that time, not one person from this town has set foot on it willingly." He wasn't exaggerating. Local boat mechanics refused to service it. Harbor workers wouldn't even tie new dock lines to it. The few outsiders who'd been hired for maintenance work over the years had quit within days, claiming the boat felt wrong somehow. But I needed the money. My business was barely staying afloat, and the estate was offering enough to keep me operational for another year. More importantly, I needed something challenging enough to occupy every waking moment, something that would stop me from spending my days staring at the water and wondering what really happened to my sister. The Meridian's Edge had belonged to Quentin Ashford, a tech billionaire who'd made his fortune in software development before dying in a private plane crash 3 years earlier. He'd kept the yacht anchored in our harbor as his East Coast retreat, though locals whispered that he used it for more than vacation cruising. People reported strange lights flickering on deck at all hours, the sound of heavy equipment being moved around at night, and an unusual amount of helicopter traffic to and from the yacht's landing pad. None of that concerned me until I found those research documents in his study. Marine biology papers, water contamination reports, correspondence with environmental scientists. Why would a software mogul need extensive marine research data? And why would he be paying consultants like Della to conduct water quality assessments? The yacht itself was a masterpiece of engineering. 180 feet of luxury that could sleep 20 guests in comfort while maintaining the speed and range of a serious ocean-going vessel. But as I explored deeper into its layout, I noticed modifications that seemed unusual for a pleasure craft. Extra storage compartments, reinforced deck areas that looked like they'd been designed to support heavy equipment, and a communication system sophisticated enough for commercial maritime operations. My Uncle Ferris had warned me to stay away from the boat, but he wouldn't explain why. When I pressed him for details, he just shook his head and said some secrets were buried for good reasons. Standing in my workshop that morning, watching the sunrise paint the Meridian's Edge in shades of gold and shadow, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't just going to restore this yacht. I was going to learn its secrets. If there was any connection between Ashford and Della's disappearance, I was going to find it. I owed her that much. My first full day aboard the Meridian's Edge started before sunrise. I climbed the gangway with my toolbox and coffee, determined to approach this like any other restoration job. The yacht's exterior needed minimal work, but I knew the real challenges would be hidden beneath the surface, in the mechanical systems and interior spaces that hadn't been properly maintained since Ashford's death. The moment I stepped into the main salon, that feeling of wrongness hit me again. Everything was too perfect, too untouched. Most abandoned boats show signs of neglect. Dust, moisture damage, the gradual decay that comes with sitting empty. But the Meridian's Edge looked like Ashford had just stepped out for lunch 3 years ago. His personal study occupied the entire starboard side of the upper deck, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. The desk was an antique mahogany piece that probably cost more than most people's cars, covered with nautical charts, expensive instruments, and stacks of documents. I'd expected to find business papers, maybe some personal correspondence. Instead, I found myself staring at research that belonged in a marine biology lab. Water contamination reports from locations all along our coast, toxicity studies on industrial chemicals, correspondence with environmental scientists from universities. I recognized, including the marine research program where Della had been working on her graduate degree. The papers weren't just casual reading. They were marked up with handwritten notes in the margins, highlighted sections, and sticky notes with questions and calculations. Why would a software billionaire need detailed studies on ocean pollution? Photographed every document with my phone, my hands shaking as I recognized some of the research locations. These were the same coordinates Della had been investigating in her independent work, the deep water sites where she'd been taking contamination readings for months before she disappeared. Then I found the Project Deepwater files. The folder was thick with contracts, payment authorizations, and correspondence dating back almost 2 years. Ashford hadn't just been reading about marine contamination, he'd been funding research into it. The project involved at least a dozen marine biologists from different institutions, all being paid substantial consulting fees to conduct water quality assessments in specific offshore locations. Della's contract was near the bottom of the stack. $50,000 for 6 months of deep water testing and analysis, more money than she'd ever mentioned to our family. According to the paperwork, she'd been working for Ashford since the previous fall, providing regular reports on contamination levels in ecosystem health in protected marine areas. My sister had been keeping secrets. I called her university advisor, Dr. Sarah Chen, who'd worked with Della throughout her graduate program. "Oh yes, Della mentioned she'd taken on some private consulting work," Dr. Chen said. "She was very excited about it, said it would give her access to research sites that were usually off-limits to graduate students. She never mentioned who was funding it, just that the client valued discretion." "Did she ever seem concerned about the work? Worried or scared?" There was a pause. "Now that you mention it, in her final weeks she seemed increasingly anxious. She started asking questions about whistleblower protections and what obligations researchers had to report environmental crimes. I assumed it was related to her thesis work." After hanging up, I sat in Ashford's study trying to piece together what I knew. My sister had been secretly working for a billionaire, investigating the same waters where she'd eventually disappeared. She'd been asking about reporting environmental crimes, and her last phone call to me had been about finding proof of illegal dumping. That afternoon, I decided to examine the yacht's mechanical spaces. Most restoration work requires getting intimate with a boat's guts. The engine room, electrical systems, and storage areas where the real problems usually hide. But the Meridian's Edge had been modified in ways that didn't make sense for a luxury yacht. The engine room was twice the size it needed to be, with mounting points for equipment that was no longer there. Heavy-duty electrical cables ran to compartments that seemed purpose-built for scientific instruments. Most telling, the yacht had been fitted with an industrial-grade water filtration system and storage tanks that could hold thousands of gallons of liquid. This wasn't a pleasure craft. This was a floating laboratory. I called my Uncle Ferris from the yacht's deck, needing to hear a familiar voice. "Cadence, Please tell me you're calling to say you finished that job and you're off that cursed boat. Uncle Ferris, I need you to tell me what you know about Quentin Ashford. Not the rumors, not the gossip. What do you actually know? The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. Ferris? That man used to come into the diner sometimes, usually late at night after his boat had been out all day. He'd sit in the corner booth and make phone calls that sounded more like arguments. I heard him talking about disposal methods and contamination levels. I heard him mention your sister's name more than once. My blood went cold. When did you hear him mention Della? The last time was about a week before she disappeared. He was angry, talking to someone about a researcher who was asking too many questions and threatening to go public with findings. He said the situation needed to be contained. That night, I couldn't bring myself to leave the yacht. I sat in the study until well after midnight, going through every document I could find, trying to understand what Della had discovered and why it might have gotten her killed. Because by then I was certain that's what had happened. My sister hadn't died in an equipment failure. She'd been murdered for asking the right questions about the wrong man. In the bottom drawer of Ashford's desk, I found a maritime GPS unit with saved coordinates. Dozens of locations marked as disposal sites and testing areas. Many of them matched the coordinates from Della's research notes. Others were in deeper waters, far from the coastal areas where environmental monitoring typically occurred. I plugged the GPS unit into my laptop and downloaded the data. Ashford had been making regular trips to these coordinates for years, always at night, always alone according to the yacht's automated logging system. Whatever he'd been disposing of out there, he'd been doing it systematically and secretly. My phone buzzed with a text from my father. Cadence, come home, now. There are things about that yacht you need to know, things I should have told you before you took this job, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. Because somewhere on this yacht was the evidence that would explain what happened to Della, and I was going to find it, even if it killed me. I drove home from the marina at 3 a.m, my father's urgent text burning in my mind. The house was dark except for the porch light he always left on for me, but I could see him silhouetted in the kitchen window, pacing like he used to do when Della and I missed curfew as teenagers. He met me at the door before I could even knock, his face grim in the yellow porch light. Dad, what's going on? What do you know about the yacht that you haven't told me? He led me to the kitchen table where he'd laid out a manila folder thick with documents. Harbor records, Coast Guard reports, and photographs I'd never seen before. I should have burned these years ago, he said, his voice heavy with regret. But I kept thinking someday they might be evidence. Someday someone would ask the right questions. The first photograph showed the Meridian's edge at night, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. The yacht was anchored in deep water, far from the harbor, with floodlights illuminating the deck. Heavy equipment was visible, including what looked like industrial pumps and storage containers. I took these pictures over several years, Dad explained. Ashford would take that yacht out at least twice a month, always at night, always alone. He'd anchor in international waters and spend hours doing something that required a lot of equipment and generated a lot of waste. The next photograph showed barrels being lowered over the yacht's side on mechanical winches. Even in the grainy night vision image, I could see warning labels on the containers. Toxic waste disposal, I whispered. That's what I suspected. But I had no proof, no jurisdiction in international waters, and frankly, no one who would listen to a small-town harbor master making accusations against a billionaire. Dad pulled out Coast Guard incident reports dating back 5 years. Unusual fish kills in our coastal waters, unexplained contamination readings, reports of dead marine life washing up on beaches after Ashford's night trips. Every time that yacht went out, we'd find evidence of environmental damage within a week, but the timing was always dismissed as coincidence. Then he showed me the report that made my blood run cold. An incident summary from 6 months ago, filed the day before Della disappeared. Your sister came to see me that evening. She was terrified, Cadence. She'd been out on a research boat and followed Ashford's yacht to one of his disposal sites. She watched him dump containers of industrial waste directly into protected marine sanctuary waters. I sank into a kitchen chair, the weight of realization crushing down on me. She saw him committing environmental crimes. Worse than that, she took photographs, water samples, documented everything. She had enough evidence to send him to prison for decades and cost his companies hundreds of millions in cleanup and fines. Why didn't she go to the authorities immediately? Dad's expression darkened. She tried. She called the EPA, the Coast Guard, even the FBI Environmental Crimes Unit. But Ashford had connections everywhere. Within hours of her making those calls, she received a visit from his security team. He pulled out a police report I'd never seen before. Della had filed a complaint about harassment and intimidation, describing how two men in expensive suits had shown up at her apartment to make it clear that her research findings would be dismissed as the work of an overzealous graduate student with no credibility. They told her that accidents happen to people who make false accusations against important businessmen. Dad continued. They mentioned that diving is dangerous work and equipment failures can be fatal. The threat was clear, and now I understood why Della had been so frightened during our last phone conversation. She hadn't just discovered illegal dumping. She'd discovered a systematic environmental crime operation, and the man behind it was willing to kill to keep it secret. So what did she decide to do? I asked, though I was starting to suspect I knew the answer. She decided to gather more evidence, enough that no amount of influence or intimidation could suppress it. She planned one final dive to the dumping site, to collect water samples and photograph the containers on the ocean floor. The dive where she disappeared. Dad nodded, his eyes filled with tears he'd been holding back for months. I begged her not to go. I told her to leave town, to transfer schools, to let someone else fight this battle. But you know your sister. Once she decided something was right, nothing could stop her. Looking at the evidence spread across our kitchen table, I made the decision that would define everything that happened next. My father had been protecting these documents for months, hoping someday justice would come for Ashford. But Ashford was dead, and the truth about what happened to Della was still hidden somewhere on that yacht. I'm going back tomorrow, I told him. I'm going to search every inch of that boat until I find proof of what he did to her. Cadence, no, it's too dangerous. If Ashford's people killed Della to keep their secret, they won't hesitate to kill you too. Dad, Ashford is dead. His operation is finished. But somewhere on that yacht is evidence that will prove Della was murdered and bring justice for what he did to our waters. I stood up from the table, my resolve hardening into something unbreakable. I'm not just restoring that boat anymore. I'm solving a murder case. The next morning, I returned to the Meridian's edge with new purpose. I wasn't just looking for hidden compartments or unusual modifications anymore. I was conducting a forensic investigation. I brought every tool I owned, crowbars, drill bits, metal detectors, even underwater cameras in case I needed to examine the yacht's hull below the waterline. I started with the assumption that if Ashford had killed Della to protect his secret, he would have needed to dispose of evidence quickly. Her diving equipment, her research materials, anything that connected her to his illegal operation. The yacht was the most logical place to hide that evidence, especially if he'd planned to dispose of it during one of his night runs. I began systematically examining every storage compartment, every hidden space, every area that could conceal something Ashford didn't want found. The yacht's luxury appearance was a facade covering a sophisticated criminal operation, and I was going to expose every detail of it. My phone kept buzzing with calls from my father, from Uncle Ferris, from friends worried about my safety. But I ignored them all. This was bigger than boat restoration now. This was about finding the truth that cost my sister her life. By afternoon, I'd discovered hidden panels behind the master suite's headboard, concealed storage areas beneath the main deck flooring, and a sophisticated ventilation system that suggested the yacht had been used for activities requiring careful air filtration. Everything pointed to the Meridian's edge being far more than a luxury vessel. It was a floating crime scene, and somewhere within its modified structure was the evidence that would prove exactly what had happened to Della. 3 days into my systematic search of the yacht, I found the seam. It was almost invisible, hidden behind an ornate mirror in the master suite that reflected the harbor lights at just the right angle to conceal the hairline crack in the wall paneling. I'd been running my hands along every surface, tapping for hollow spaces, when my fingertip caught the tiny gap. The mirror was heavier than it looked, mounted on a pivot mechanism that swung aside to reveal a hidden door. My heart hammered against my ribs as I shined my flashlight into the darkness beyond. The space was larger than a closet, but smaller than a proper room, lined with soundproof foam and ventilation ducts. This wasn't just storage. This was a room, designed for secrecy. Inside, I found Ashford's real operation. The hidden chamber contained a complete marine testing laboratory with equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Water analysis machines, chemical testing kits, sample storage units, and computers with data from years of contamination monitoring. But these weren't the tools of environmental protection. They were the instruments of calculated destruction. Every surface was covered with evidence of systematic environmental crime. Charts showing dumping schedules, tide calculations for optimal dispersal of toxins, and contamination predictions that showed Ashford knew exactly how much damage his operation was causing to marine ecosystems. He hadn't been disposing of waste randomly. He'd been conducting a scientific campaign to maximize environmental destruction while minimizing detection. On the main desk, I found Della's research files, not copies, her actual field notebooks, complete with her handwriting, her water sample, analysis, and her growing horror as she realized the scope of what she'd uncovered. The final entries were dated just days before she disappeared, and reading them felt like hearing her voice from beyond the grave. Day 127, contamination levels have increased 400% in the past month. Whatever Ashford is dumping isn't just industrial waste. These readings suggest radioactive materials and biological toxins that shouldn't exist outside military or research facilities. Day 130. I trace the source containers. They're coming from defense contractors and pharmaceutical companies. Ashford isn't just disposing of waste. He's being paid to make evidence disappear. Day 133. I know he suspects I'm gathering evidence against him. His security team has been following me for 3 days. I need to get proof to the authorities before something happens to me. But it was the final entry that broke my heart. Day 135. I'm scared. Really scared. But I can't stop now. Too many innocent creatures are dying because of what this man is doing. If something happens to me, I've hidden backup evidence where Katie will find it. She's the only person I trust to finish what I started. Behind the notebooks, I found Della's waterproof camera case. Inside was her underwater camera, still containing the memory card from her final dive. My hands shook as I connected it to one of Ashford's computers and opened the video files. The footage started underwater. Della's voice clear through her diving communication system as she narrated her descent to the dumping site. The water was crystal clear at the surface, but as she dove deeper, the clarity turned to an ominous murk. The ocean floor was littered with industrial containers, many split open and leaking their contents into the marine environment. This is unbelievable, Della's recorded voice whispered. There are hundreds of barrels down here. Some of them are military markings. Others are from pharmaceutical companies. The environmental damage is beyond anything I imagined. The camera captured her collecting water samples near the dumping site, documenting serial numbers on the containers, and photographing the ecological devastation. Dead fish floated in the contaminated water. Coral formations were bleached white, and the ocean floor was covered with a toxic slime that killed everything it touched. Then the footage changed. Della surfaced from her dive to find the Meridians, Edge anchored directly above her research boat. She'd been discovered. Oh God, he's here. Ashford found me. The camera angle shifted as Della tried to swim away, but Ashford's yacht was faster than her small research vessel. The audio picked up the sound of engines approaching, then voices shouting across the water. Dr. Morrison, I think we need to have a conversation about your research findings. The video showed Della being forced aboard the Meridian's Edge at gunpoint by 2 men I didn't recognize. The camera was still recording when they brought her into this very room where I now stood. You've seen too much. Ashford's voice was calm, almost conversational. I've built a very profitable business disposing of materials that governments and corporations need to disappear. Your research threatens to expose clients who pay me millions to keep their secrets buried. You're killing the entire marine ecosystem." Della's voice was strong despite her fear. "The contamination will spread up the food chain. People will die from this. People die from a lot of things. Car accidents, equipment failures during diving expeditions, unfortunate encounters with marine predators. The ocean is dangerous." The threat was unmistakable and Della knew it. But even facing death, my sister refused to back down. "I've already sent copies of my research to multiple agencies. Even if you kill me, the truth will come out." Ashford laughed. "Your graduate student research? Against my word and the word of my scientific consultants? Who's going to believe a naive girl over established experts with impeccable credentials? The physical evidence will speak for itself." "What physical evidence?" "Your research boat had an unfortunate accident. Equipment failure caused it to sink in very deep water. Your body was never recovered, so tragic. As for your research materials, well, they went down with the ship." The video became chaotic as a struggle began. Della fought back, trying to reach her communication equipment to send a distress signal. The camera fell and spun, capturing fragments of the fight before the screen went black, but the audio continued recording. I heard Della's voice, defiant until the end. "My sister will figure out what really happened. Cadence is smarter than you think, and she won't stop looking until she finds the truth. Your sister restores boats. She's not a threat to anyone. You don't know my family. We don't give up. And we don't forget." The recording ended with the sound of splash, then silence. Sitting in that hidden room, holding the camera that captured my sister's final moments, I finally understood everything. Ashford hadn't just killed Della to protect his illegal dumping operation. He'd killed her because she'd threatened his entire criminal enterprise, a network that involved military contractors, pharmaceutical companies, and government agencies that needed toxic secrets to disappear forever. But Della had been right about one thing. I wasn't going to give up, and I wasn't going to forget. Behind her notebooks, I found one final piece of evidence. A letter addressed to me in Della's careful handwriting, sealed in a waterproof container. "Katie, if you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true. But I know you, and I know you won't let him get away with what he's done. The coordinates for the main dumping site are GPS marked in my diving computer. The contamination evidence is in my research files. Most importantly, Ashford recorded everything. His clients demand proof of disposal, so there are videos of every dumping run stored on his computer servers. Find them, and you'll have evidence that will bring down not just him, but the entire network of people who pay him to make their toxic secrets disappear. I love you, sister. Finish what I started." The computer servers were hidden behind another panel, and when I accessed them with Della's login information, I found terabytes of incriminating video footage. Years of illegal dumping runs, meetings with corporate clients, and detailed records of exactly what toxic materials had been disposed of in our coastal waters. Ashford had been meticulous about documenting his crimes, never realizing that his careful records would eventually become evidence of the largest environmental crime prosecution in history. I sat in that hidden laboratory until dawn, copying every file, every video, every piece of evidence onto multiple backup drives. By the time the sun rose over Millfield Harbor, I had enough documentation to expose not just Ashford's crimes, but the entire network of corporations and government agencies that had paid him to make their toxic secrets disappear. My hands were steady as I called the FBI's Environmental Crimes Unit, the same number Della had called 6 months earlier when her warnings had been ignored. This time would be different. This time I had proof that couldn't be dismissed or suppressed. Agent Maria Santos arrived within 3 hours, accompanied by a team of federal investigators who spent 2 days cataloging evidence from the yacht. The scope of the crimes was staggering. Ashford's operation had been disposing of radioactive waste from nuclear facilities, experimental biological weapons from defense contractors, and toxic pharmaceutical byproducts that should never have existed outside secured research facilities. "This is the largest environmental crime case in federal history," Agent Santos told me as they loaded the final boxes of evidence. "Your sister's documentation will help us prosecute not just Ashford's organization, but dozens of corporate executives who paid him to commit these crimes. The investigation moved quickly once the evidence was in federal hands. Within weeks, arrest warrants were issued for executives at 7 major corporations, 3 defense contractors, and 2 pharmaceutical companies. The total cleanup costs were estimated at over $2 billion, all of which would be paid by the companies whose illegal waste had poisoned our coastal waters. But the most important result was what happened to our marine ecosystem. Environmental teams began immediate remediation efforts at the dumping sites Della had identified. The contaminated areas were sealed off, the toxic materials removed, and a comprehensive restoration program was launched to rebuild the damaged marine habitats. My father finally found peace with Della's death, knowing that her sacrifice had protected countless marine lives and exposed a criminal conspiracy that reached the highest levels of corporate and government power. The guilt he'd carried for months began to lift as he watched cleanup crews working around the clock to repair the damage Ashford had caused. "She was always the brave one," he said as we stood on the harbor dock, watching the environmental restoration vessels working offshore. Even as a little girl, she'd stand up to bullies twice her size if she thought they were hurting someone smaller. I should have known she'd never back down from a fight this important. Uncle Ferris stopped asking customers to avoid talking about the yacht. Instead, he started telling stories about Della's courage, how a graduate student had taken on a billionaire criminal and won even though it cost her life. The Harbor Light Diner became an unofficial memorial to environmental heroes, with Della's picture on the wall next to marine conservation information. The Meridian's edge itself was seized as evidence and eventually converted into something Della would have loved. After the investigation concluded, federal authorities donated the yacht to the National Marine Sanctuary Foundation. It now serves as a floating education center, teaching students about marine conservation and the importance of protecting our oceans from illegal dumping. I couldn't bring myself to work on the restoration project, but I visit the yacht regularly when it docks in our harbor. School children tour the vessel where my sister died, learning about the marine ecosystem she gave her life to protect. Their excitement about ocean conservation would have made Della incredibly proud. The hidden laboratory where I found the evidence is now a classroom where marine biology students learn about water contamination detection and environmental crime investigation. A plaque on the wall reads, "In memory of Dr. Della Morrison, whose courage to speak truth to power saved countless marine lives and inspired a new generation of environmental protectors." 6 months after the investigation concluded, I received a call from the university where Della had been pursuing her graduate degree. They wanted to establish the Della Morrison Environmental Justice Scholarship, providing funding for students investigating corporate environmental crimes. The first recipient was a young woman studying illegal waste disposal in coastal communities, continuing the work my sister had started. The scholarship program has grown beyond anything I imagined. Students from around the world apply to study environmental crime investigation, inspired by Della's example of courage in the face of powerful opposition. The program has led to the exposure of illegal dumping operations in 12 countries, proving that my sister's legacy extends far beyond our small harbor town. I still restore boats for a living, but my work has taken on new meaning. Every vessel I repair represents hope for clean oceans and healthy marine ecosystems. When clients ask about my motivation, I tell them about Della, about how one person's courage to stand up for what's right can change the entire world. The most important lesson I learned from this experience is that secrets have a way of surfacing, no matter how deep they're buried. Ashford thought he could make evidence disappear in the ocean's depths, but the truth always finds a way to the surface. My sister made sure of that by hiding evidence where someone who loved her would eventually find it. Environmental crime continues in waters around the world, but now there are people watching, people investigating, people ready to fight, back against corporate powers who treat our oceans like toxic waste dumps. Della's story inspired a movement of environmental defenders who refuse to stay silent when powerful interests threaten our planet's future. Today, when I stand on our harbor dock at sunset, I don't search the horizon for Della's research vessel anymore. Instead, I watch the conservation boats working offshore, the educational vessels teaching marine biology, and the cleanup crews continuing to repair the damage Ashford caused. The water is cleaner now, the marine life is returning, and my sister's sacrifice continues to protect creatures who can't speak for themselves. That's the real power of standing up for what's right, even when it's dangerous. The impact doesn't end with one person's courage. It multiplies, inspiring others to fight their own battles against injustice, creating ripples that spread across the world like waves from a stone dropped in still water. If this story moved you, if Della's courage inspired you to think about your own power to make a difference, please like this video and subscribe to this channel. Share it with anyone who needs to know that one person's voice can change the world, even when powerful forces try to silence it. Because the biggest tragedy isn't when good people die fighting for what's right. The biggest tragedy is when their sacrifice gets forgotten, and the battles they fought have to be fought all over again. Remember Della Morrison. Remember that. Courage is contagious. And remember that sometimes the most important fights are the ones that seem impossible to win.